When you hear the term chick flick, what comes to your mind? Maybe you think of a romance film, or maybe just a story that's centered on women's experiences. Or perhaps you think of films of a certain tone and aesthetic, particularly light-hearted journeys of self-discoveries, which may or may not include shopping montages. And at worst, you might think of crowd-pleasing fluff with trivial conflicts. A lot of so-called chick flicks have made their way into becoming cultural phenomenons, despite the term itself coming from a place of derision. When I was growing up, I remember being confused as to why the movies I'd regularly watch were considered chick flicks, because to me, they were just regular movies. The term chick flick was coined in the 1990s and is defined as a type of movie that focuses on a female character, or characters, and are marketed towards an audience of women. The term chick flick hints that movies labeled as this are shallow, frivolous, and are nothing to be taken seriously. How many times has a movie been described as good despite being a chick flick, when male-centered movies don't usually get the same response? And I can go off on how arbitrary this term is used. For instance, Heathers is a violent dark comedy that focuses on controversial subject matter. There's barely any romance or fluff in the narrative, and yet it's still considered a girly chick flick, which is fine, but it's still lumped into other women-centered films that don't resemble it. I couldn't help but wonder why chick flicks have such a divided reputation. In the spirit of Valentine's Day, we're going to look into the history of women-centered films, and why they have a lot more substance than given credit for. So now, let's get started. Before there were chick flicks, there were the women's films of the 1930s and 40s. These types of movies were intended to appeal towards women audiences, with stories that mostly focused on the domestic sphere and interpersonal relationships. The success of women's films were explained in A Woman's View, written by Janine Basinger. These are not films that tell a lie, like many of Hollywood's escapist dreams. These are films that tell the truth, but only because they are about the unhappiness of women. A lot of women's films were also regarded as melodramas, or movies that have the power to bring tears to the audience. While melodramas, synonymous with women's films, were popular, they weren't particularly respected as real cinema, like how crime dramas or literary adaptations were. Women's films were seen as too commercial and not artistically complex enough. I'm not surprised that film snobbery have existed for nearly 100 years. While there have been plenty of films that focused on women characters, Breakfast at Tiffany's is one of the earliest examples of a chick flick by modern definitions. This movie didn't resemble the novel it was based on, which was tonally dark and focused on platonic love instead of romance. Paramount Pictures changed the plot into a love story with a happy ending, all to give the audience what they wanted, with the help of a little black dress and a Tiffany diamond tiara. Holly Golightly is a free-spirited character who doesn't want to be tied down by social expectations. She's an independent socialite who is open to the idea of becoming a high society wife, but has too much fun living a quirky but glamorous life in the adventurous city of New York. In the midst of Holly's party-heavy lifestyle, she gets romantically interested in a man who moved into her building and learns to open up with him emotionally. Through this relationship, Holly learns that love isn't a matter of ownership, but instead is about mutual respect and acceptance of each other's true selves. Upon its release, reports of Breakfast at Tiffany's questioned whether or not Holly Golightly is a good role model, which could be attributed to her being different from other movie heroines of the time. Holly Golightly isn't perfect, nor is she irredeemable. Along with her being self-conscious, her character and emotional arc feels genuine, and as a result, audiences can identify with her. Breakfast at Tiffany's impacted how women are presented on film by showing a lead being glamorous, charismatic, and emotionally complex. It would also spark a trend of New York City being a character within the story. By the 1970s, many chick flicks took a more realistic and gritty tone, some of which didn't have a happy ending. Movies like Love Story and Carrie are renowned for being modern tragedies, and The Way We Were represents the type of relationships that created the book He's Just Not That Into You. And in reflection of a changing reality, more female-centered movies showcase life in professional workspaces and the various shenanigans that comes with it. Other films were also coming-of-age stories, along with the trend of high school movies. The wave of rom-coms were just around the corner. While When Harry Met Sally brought new life into the romantic comedy genre, Pretty Woman took it to a new level. While initially going to be a drama with a tragic ending, Pretty Woman enchanted audiences as a modern Cinderella story. Shrek 2 even mentioned this as a classic fairy tale. Embracing fantasy was one of the themes of Pretty Woman, which is basically why this film greatly sanitizes the subject matter it represents. Like many 90s rom-coms, Pretty Woman is known to be one of the films that didn't age well, but nonetheless influenced other films with a similar lighthearted tone. During the 90s and early 2000s, the romantic comedy was immensely popular and was the dominant genre that starred women characters and had an audience of mostly women. Rom-com heroines were typically quirky, offbeat, and in a tiresome pursuit of love, in a world that seems jaded and unromantic. But their imperfections help lead them into their happily ever after, for better and for the worse. Films such as Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail have been retrospectively criticized for how they display unhealthy behaviors and relationship dynamics, as well as how these films reinforce sexist stereotypes and reinforces the idea that one can't be a whole person without their second half. But aside from romance stories, some women-centered films such as A League of Their Own and Romy and Michelle's High School Reunion were more focused on friendship. Clueless was about this as well, but I will say I just don't love the ending. But one movie that mixes romance and self-development was Legally Blonde. To understand the cultural context for this film, in the early 2000s, there really was an assumption that being a girly girl and being intelligent were exclusive qualities. Challenging stereotypes is a major theme in this movie, and is something that several people can still learn from today. In the pursuit of trying to get back an ex, Elle Woods studies law at Harvard, and is judged for how she chooses to express herself. Because of her interest in fashion and pink, she's assumed to be unintelligent and not one to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, she's excelling in her classes and brightens the lives of people around her. After realizing that her ex is not worth getting back, Elle changes her focus and dedicates herself to becoming the best lawyer she can be. While working towards this goal comes with its own set of difficulties, she's not going to let some loser get in the way of her dreams. And on top of everything, her knowledge of hair care solved a case of violent crime. Some things are not as frivolous as they're rumored to be. The thing is, whether one appears stereotypically girly or not, people will always have something to say. The best option is to express yourself in a way that feels authentic to you. While its depiction of law school was pretty unrealistic, and Elle kind of did some unauthorized practice of law, Legally Blonde is regarded as a genuinely empowering movie, and helped launch the Barbiecore aesthetic for future chick flicks. In my opinion, I'd say that girly cinema peaked in the 2000s. The plots were fun and lighthearted, there were plenty of memorable fashion moments, and the energy was upbeat and optimistic. Unless you're feeling sad and want to watch some Sofia Coppola movies. There was a trend for chick flicks to have a particular main character vibe, like in a Wattpad sort of way. The Princess Diaries, What a Girl Wants, Confessions of a Teenage Drama Queen, and the Lizzie McGuire movie personally come to mind. And while this medium may not really exist anymore, some movies of the time made it look like working in a fashion magazine was a sea of non-stop excitement. Because of The Devil Wears Prada, I could never look at Cerulean the same way again. Movies like these were aspirational, providing a fantasy of living a glamorous life when you're older. But some films didn't shy away from harsh topics. The topic of female bullying wasn't fully researched until the 1990s. Researchers have found that relational aggression, including social exclusion and spreading rumors, are common bullying tactics amongst girls. This was demonstrated in the legendary comedy film Mean Girls. Mean Girls originated as a nonfiction book, Queen Bees and Wannabes, and was transformed into a witty, satirical take on girl culture. And this movie is a rare instance where basically every line is quotable. I remember the era of 2010's YouTube, Pinterest, Tumblr, and even gift cards that reference the many amusing quotes. The humor style also plays with absurdism, with several fantasy sequences and a fast-moving bus coming out of nowhere. Mean Girls is a story about revenge, and how it may seem tempting, it's really a lot of effort for an unsatisfying prize. Katie has successfully ended the reign of Regina George, and she's more alone than ever. Instead of trying to mess someone else up, all you can do in life is to try to solve the problem in front of you. As far as chick flicks go, I'd say that Mean Girls is one of the more respected films of this type, and was very influential. I saw Mean Girls similarities in John Tucker Must, The Click, and Jennifer's Body. The era of mid-budget films like Mean Girls would come to an end by the 2010s. For the most part, films that were intended for a female audience weren't at the budgetary or marketing level as something like The Avengers. Studios preferred high-budget, high-concept films that could earn over $1 billion in the box office, instead of films that typically earn $100 million or lower. In this era of cinematic universes, more female-focused stories were adaptations from young adult novels and Wattpad stories. This included The Fault in Our Stars and The Duff, which probably had one of my least favorite rom-com couples. There is also The Kissing Booth, which had one of the wildest mid-film tone shifts I've ever seen. But along with Netflix films, To All the Boys I've Loved Before is generally respected and loved. Laura Jean is shy and not very popular, but she dreams of finding love. She lives in a world of reverie, seeing real life from the perspective of classic cinema and novels. She has some dream sequences where she's in these fantasy universes. And let's be real, you've probably done that too. She writes love letters to her crushes, but more sees them as diary entries. Things go out of control when these letters are sent out to all her crushes, one of which pretends to date Laura Jean just to make his ex jealous. They have some complications, and Laura Jean learns that she needs to stop living in a fantasy world and enter reality. But in the end, she happily ends up with her crush. In an era where cynicism is seen as something to be proud of, To All the Boys is hopeful and embraces everything about love. Netflix had the market for romance films, and their next momentum was the After series, which was based on a Harry Styles fanfiction. While I've never seen any of these movies, I am aware that they've been criticized for displaying unhealthy relationships as desirable. But in the realm of romantic comedies, there has been a few instances of false promises of the comeback of the genre. Crazy Rich Asians, which was technically more of a drama, was very successful at the box office. Anyone But You was marketed as a classic screwball romantic comedy, but it seems that nobody particularly likes this movie all that much. But personally, I wouldn't really consider this to be a chick flick. So as we looked over, chick flicks come in many forms, focusing on different topics with different types of characters. So why are they lumped into a single label? One reason why this is simply because these are films with a woman protagonist. There is the conception that stereotypically masculine interests can be for everyone, where anything seen as feminine is only for women. There's also the argument that chick flicks are filled with cliches, are formulaic, and don't focus on serious topics. Some will even say that nothing happens in them. While there is no shortage of shallow criticisms towards chick flicks, they're still genuinely not without their faults. In romance media, we see romanticized, unhealthy relationship dynamics that have been portrayed as endearing. The enemies to lovers trope are especially guilty of this. There's also the over-reliance on gender stereotypes, such as being locked into petty rivalries, as well as the glamorization of shopping and other material-related hobbies. This relates to the makeover trope, where characters who are initial outsiders finally fit into the socially accepted beauty standard and get treated a lot better for it. These makeovers can be a metaphor for characters coming out of their shell and developing confidence. But maybe some things can be switched up and show a makeover sequence where former wallflowers can get an eternal readjustment. And at the same time, there is the utilization of the not like other girls trope, which needlessly pits people against each other. Many chick flicks also lack intersectionality and centers on narrow perspectives, though this is slowly changing. But for the most part, these aren't the reasons as to why chick flicks aren't taken seriously. When I did some research as to why some people don't like chick flicks, some responses I've seen are some of the most over-the-top, shallow criticisms you could ever think of. There are so many generalized statements like chick flicks are bad, and yet don't provide any examples. I was initially going to share some non-insightful responses from these critics, but truth be told, they don't deserve to be given the light of day. It is true that some chick flicks are terrible, atrocious even, but at the same time, some films that target male audiences have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. By that logic, all movies that focus on a man's perspective are bad and not worth watching. Any sort of media that's considered feminine has been regarded as something that only a female audience can enjoy. Even witty, well-written pieces of media can be described as a guilty pleasure as long as it focuses on topics that are associated with femininity. Chick flicks are associated with sacred narratives that are unrealistic and too focused on love and marriage. While marriage might be a central focus on a lot of these movies, there's still other themes that can resonate with audiences. For instance, 27 Dresses is a movie that ends with a wedding, but it's foremost about learning the importance of self-worth outside of being a support system for others. The theme of The Devil Wears Prada is knowing when to walk away from toxic work environments. Some chick flicks offer introspective stories on the trials of growing up, which is shown in Lady Bird. Upon its release, Uptown Girls was critically panned and was described as having 2 obnoxious lead characters and an uneven screenplay. When it's been reevaluated as a story of healing from loss and the transformation of growing up. And going back to Legally Blonde, the film's message of striving for one's goals while also staying true to yourself resonates with viewers today. Reese Witherspoon even stated in 2017, "At least once a week, I have a woman come up to me and say, I went to law school because of Legally Blonde. It's incredible. You can be unapologetically feminine and also smart and driven. Also, without Legally Blonde, we wouldn't get this iconic video." And even if chick flicks are too lovey-dovey and sentimental, I don't see how there's anything inherently wrong with that. True love is one of the most powerful things we can ever experience. and can tell an infinite amount of stories. Some films might show up better than others, but still. It's hard to say what's exactly the current state of chick flicks. There have been a few that's come out recently to very mixed reception, but I still think that studios are missing an opportunity. You'd think the success of Barbie demonstrated that films with girly aesthetics aren't just a niche thing, but instead we got more films about products. How do you miss the mark this much? Even today, the term chick flick is used as a dismissive phrase for films that are nothing to be taken seriously. And personally, I'm not a fan of describing films in that way. I would prefer the term feminine storytelling, mostly because I like the sound of it better. While women-centered films are seen as unrealistic stories, I see nothing wrong with embracing a little bit of fantasy and magic in your everyday life. I want to thank everyone who subscribed to my channel, and I hope you all have a wonderful Valentine's Day.